This week, FIH Inside the D is heading back in time. We're returning to the home of hockey to trace the steps of where it all began. Bushy Park in Teddington, on the outskirts of London. It was here where the foundations were laid for the game we know today. We'll be looking back at some of the landmark moments of the sport and, of course, keeping up with all things current. Coming up, Mad Maddie.
Oh my goodness.
Swapping sticks.
That was the birth of the Indian stick. It is much shorter.
And mastering the dribble.
This is how it's done.
First up, though, is the story of how hockey, as we know it today, began. And for this, we turn to one of Teddington's own.
I'm Evie Wood, goalkeeper at Teddington Hockey Club. You can date stick and ball games back to prehistoric times in Egypt around 2000 BC. Fast forward several centuries, and a more recognisable version of the game emerged in the 1750s, mainly developing in British public schools. As far as the more modern version of hockey goes, the start of this can be traced back to 1862 in Blackheath in South East London, where the first official club started. But under their rules, the game was played with a cube instead of a ball. The pitch was 200 yards, which is almost double the size of the pitch today, and they played 15-a-side instead of 11. And so it came down to Teddington. As you can see, this is a cricket club, but the players needed a winter activity to keep them going throughout the colder months. So in 1871, they came up with the start of hockey as we know it today. There are three crucial differences. They played on a smaller, even pitch, they limited the amount of players to 11, and most importantly, they played with a cricket ball instead of a cube. Since then, the rules have been tweaked countless times, but this is where it all officially started.
From its official formation in 1875, hockey's rise was rapid. In 1887, the first women's team began, Molesey Ladies, and within a decade the UK had around 200 clubs. 1895 saw the first international match as Ireland beat Wales, and by the turn of the century, hockey had started to take off across Europe and beyond. With Britain's overseas interests in the empire, the sport also quickly grew in India, so much so that from their inclusion in the 1928 Olympics, India won 7 of the next 9 golds, Pakistan with the other 2. During this time, the women's game continued to thrive at home and abroad, including the USA. Crowds of up to 70,000 filling London's Wembley Stadium at the pinnacle of a golden age. And in 1980, female teams finally entered the Olympics, Zimbabwe shocking the world to take the first gold. The previous decade had seen the beginning of the World Cup for both genders, Pakistan defeating India en route to beating hosts Spain in the first men's final. 2 years later, it was the Dutch who triumphed on home soil. And in 1975, it was India's turn to take the title with victory over their arch rivals. The 76 Montreal Olympics marked a pivotal change in the sport, with the introduction of synthetic pitches. It largely prompted the end of India and Pakistan's dominance, benefiting the more affluent nations who could afford artificial surfaces. With some notable exceptions, the ensuing decades have seen the Netherlands, Germany and Australia emerge as the powerhouses in both the men's and women's game. Argentina more recently adding their name to that list. And that's your very brief history of hockey.
Not only has India been a prominent player in the evolution of the sport, but it also proved a vital nation in shaping the modern game, quite literally.
The evolution of the hockey stick starts in the early part of the 19th century with people making what we call hedgerow sticks. Going to the hedgerow, cutting out a piece of wood that has a bend on the end of it. By the 1870s, people were playing a structured game to rules and they needed better equipment. And so they used English ash wood, It was easily bent, so that gave us the English head stick. We had a large army in India playing sport. Instead of importing stuff, they started to make sports equipment in India. But they had no ash, so they had to turn to a wood called mulberry. Much harder, doesn't bend as easily. And so when they manufactured these sticks, it meant they had breakages. They had to find a use for those broken sticks, and that was the birth of the Indian stick, an English head shape, but it is much shorter. With the English head stick, you have to go behind the ball. The Indian head stick, instead of being behind the ball, you're going over the top of the ball, much faster. And so that was the way in which the Indians became so outstanding at hockey through the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, winning the Olympics time after time. Many European sides were still using longer heads like this, and the Indians were using their very nimble and quick short heads. From there, you came to the modern era, where sticks are made from composite materials, but heads are still very short. That is a quick resume through the hockey stick.